Peace, people. Yeah, we got a response from Chris MVP Harris, as you can see in my notifications. Let's go look and see what this guy responded and said. Now, this was to my video that I sent him about him lying about this Bantu expansion. All right. Now, check this out. He says, you so misled is funny. Heplo group E1B1A is an ancient brother to E1B1B, but has left a completely different fingerprint on the world today. These branches split one another around 47,500 years ago in the Horn of Africa, followed by the emergence of prominent SNP mutation EM2, which gained footing there. Ha ha ha, then he laughs. So what we see here is what this guy is going to attempt to do if he ever try to debate me, and I'm going to bust that hiney like a penitentiary booty bandit. You dig? So check it. If he ever comes to me with this foolishness, I'm going to make it clear that you cannot take a linguistic classification called Bantu. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with a culture. It has nothing to do with an ethnicity. It has nothing to do with the people. It's nothing but a linguistic classification. How dare you ever try in a debate against Yasha ben Israel, try to shoehorn a linguistic classification, my brother, my dumb brother, how to shoehorn a linguistic classification into a genetic study of E1B1A and E1B1B. That is silly, ridiculous, and highly fallacious, brother. Because of the simple fact that the Bantu is a linguistic group, and many people that are not even E1B1A, that are Bantu speakers, people that are not even in the E branches, E1E1A, E1B1B, and even the snaps, people that have nothing to do with that are not even related to them, that are Bantu speakers, brother. So that has nothing to do. You cannot use a genetic study to validate or even to identify a linguistic classification. So as you can see, my reply was silly dumb nicka. Nobody was calling themselves Bantu 10,000 years ago. And surely they wasn't doing it 48, 46,000 years ago. All right? That's really goofy and foolish. So what was they called? Because Bantu wasn't it. Since I'm so misled, in what direction and destination am I being misled to or from? You're going to stop saying stupid shit around me, dummy. There was more to be read, or no? I guess not. These guys coming with all this outdated information. As we look at real African news that is emanating out of the continent of Africa, all right? Let's take a look at this re-examination of history. It's called New Research Poke Holes in the Idea of Bantu Expansion in West Africa. For more than a century, historians have supported the idea of a Bantu expansion that started in West Africa several millennia ago, spread across the southern half of the continent. But new research from an international team cast doubt on this version of events. It is a relatively well-known story, or at least one that African history buffs thought they knew. Starting in 3000 BCE and over a period of several millennia, Africa experienced what experts like William Bleak have coined the Bantu expansion, a white man. A massive migration movement that originated on the borders of modern Cameroon, in Nigeria, and eventually spread to eastern and southern Africa, extending its reach across half the continent. From the Cameroon grass fields to the African Great Lakes, the Bantu expansion is considered to be the greatest migration event in Africa's prehistory, and its consequences are still visible today. Virtually half of the Africans are part of the Bantu-speaking proto-language, an ancestral language that is found in countries like Gabon and Comoros and Sudan and South Africa. It was 19th century European linguists who put forward the theory that the Bantu languages descended from a common Proto-Bantu language. Understand, it was linguistics, European linguistics, who put forth this theory. All right, that the Bantu languages descended from a common Proto-Bantu language, that they went on to reconstruct the likely course of this linguistic community's expansion. German scholars William Bleak and Karl Meinhof were the first to call themselves to the specific features shared by Bantu-derived languages by distinguishing them from the Xhosa language in South Africa, for instance. American linguist Joseph Greenberg will go on to develop a classification system for African languages that supported the idea of a geographical expansion. A white man, an American linguist by the name of Joseph Greenberg, and we'll look these people up, all right? To go on to develop a classification for African languages that supported the idea of a geographic expansion, while British colonial administrator Henry Hamilton Johnston drew up the first map outlining and dating the stages of this so-called expansion. That's Henry Hamilton Johnston. That's William Bleak. What was that? Karl Meinhof. These are guys that we need to remember. There was another one up in there too. But we got those three for now. All right. Okay. Now let's read what Henry Hamilton Johnston stated. He said the term Bantu, moreover, rather negative overtones, sometimes of a most unpleasant nature. Bleak, who coined the term, was an avowed racist, while Meinhof was a member of the Nazi Party. During the apartheid era, Bantu was synonymous with black, and the word continues to be considered highly real Bantus, while portraying the Tutsi people as Neolithic from the north, or foreigners. All right? The work of these men has been used to distinguish a fine tune with widely accepted current consensus, like Chris Harris's, like Jabari's, like Garfield's, okay, which posits that the Bantu people, although we will see later on that this term is inappropriate, initially lived in an area west of the Congo Basin rainforest, around what is today known as the grass-filled region of Cameroon, and began moving elsewhere from 300 BCE onward. Between 1500 BCE and 500 CE, they reached modern-day Angola and KwaZulu Natal province in southern Africa and the African Great Lakes region in eastern Africa by crossing the vast Congo rainforest. Beginning around 500 CE, Bantu-speaking communities spread out in all directions from the African Great Lakes, reaching Sudan and pushing into Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. This story rests on the idea of a slow but continuous expansion. Take a look at this photo here, all right? That's along the small river of the forest near the Mabandaka Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is on April 2nd, 2019, okay? Much, much later, all right, than 1865 of William Bleak, okay? Rather than an ethnic group nor a culture, this version of how sub-Saharan Africa was settled has long been accepted as fact by guys like Chris Harris, by guys like Sanetta, by guys like Jabari, by guys like Garfield, all right? Which poses a few problems. However, for starters, it is based on a central but controversial notion that there is a Bantu people. It has frequently been said, written, and repeated that there is no such thing as a Bantu people, at least not in the sense which some people use the term. Example, as an ethnic group or as a culture. There's no such thing as a Bantu people, at least not in the sense in which some people use the term as an example, as an ethnic group or as a culture like Chris Harris is trying to do. All right? Nowadays, researchers are more apt to use the more carefully worded expression expansion, speaking community, instead of Bantu speaking community instead of the Bantu expansion or the Bantu people. Nowadays, researchers are more apt to use the carefully worded expression Bantu speaking community, because that is indeed what they are studying. Populations that are different from one another. They're studying populations that are different from one another, but that speak one of the 680 languages identified to date to share a common ancestor. Or a common root. To a certain extent, these populations also share some genetic similarities, but this is not a hard and fast rule. Pygmies have adopted Bantu languages, yet they're not descended from the West African communities that initiated migrations. The term Bantu has moreover rather negative overtones, Chris Harris, Garfield, sometimes of a most unpleasant nature. Bleak coined the term, all right? Bleak, who coined the term, was an avowed racist, while Meinhof was a member of the Nazi Party. During the apartheid era, Bantu was synonymous with black, and the word continues to be considerably highly real Bantus, while portraying that the Tutsi people of the Neolithics from the north or was foreigners. While other regions of Africa nevertheless put a much greater emphasis on the idea of a Bantus people, this is the case in Gabon, where an initiative to create a Bantu cultural organization called the Center of International Des Civilizations Bantu which is the CICIBA, in Libreville was undertaken. All right. While ultimately unsuccessful, efforts to revive the initiative have been made on a regular basis. A widespread population collapse. But most importantly, according to the latest findings published earlier this year by a multidisciplinary team of archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists led by Professor Cohen Bostoin from Ghent University in Belgium, in Germany, right? The idea of a continuous geographic expansion of Bantu-speaking people is downright wrong, Chris Harris. Since 2018, these researchers have been studying and radiocarbon dating pottery fragments, which are amongst the few objects that stand the test of time, recovered from 726 sites throughout the Congo rainforest. After analyzing the vessel shape and style of decoration of the artifacts, they radiocarbon dated. They also examined human genetic data and used the latest techniques to assess what are known as paleodemographic fluctuations over the last 130 generations. Their conclusion, the vast majority of the pottery remains that were recovered date back to either the early Iron Age, example, a period around 800 BCE to 400 CE. This is around the time that the children of Israel fled into Africa. Or the late Iron Age, beginning around 1000 CE. These two dates are separated by a sharp decline in human activity between 400 and 600 CE. According to Bostoin and his team, the only possible cause for this drop-off in activity is a widespread population collapse. In the words of Dirk Seidensticker, an archaeologist whose expertise includes radiocarbon dating pottery, distinct breaks in material culture confirms the existence of two clearly distinct periods of settlement in the Congo rainforest. Bostoin adds, there was a strong decline in the number of pottery groups, and this is observed throughout Central Africa, with pottery remains all but disappearing until around 1000 CE. Then there is a marked increase of pottery finds. Another thing is that when comparing the pottery fragments to the two periods, which date back to the early Iron Age and late Iron Age, respectively, the styles are completely different. The team's research gets a great deal more interesting when they start to suggest explanations for this sudden break. We noted a drop in the number of objects produced in the middle of the first millennium CE, which has led us to infer a demographic bust. Stoen says that when we tried to figure out what was behind the decline by tapping into our knowledge of that era, a period of drought brought about a reduction of a reduction of forest cover, followed by an episode of much wetter, colder climatic conditions. The year without summer. During the late Antique Little Ice Age, a cooling period that began in 536 CE, and historians dubbed the year without summer. The world went quite literally dark. There are now little doubt about the timing or magnitude of the events that so unsettled contemporaries. A cluster of volcanic eruptions, write an American historian Clyde Harper in his books The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. That's interesting. What followed, he continues, was an epic one in a few millennium cold snap, accompanied by rising levels of rainfall, reduced crop yields, and weakened immunity, and no doubt a demographic explosion of bursting rodents. And in 546 CE, one of the worst pandemics in human history struck, the Justinianic plague, named for the Byzantine emperor of Constantine, Justinian I, the first major episode of bubonic plague, not to be confused with the Black Death epidemic that devastated the West in the 14th century and 15th centuries. Likely originated in China and went on to ravage the entire Mediterranean region, killing, by an account of the Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, who lived on to tell the tale, up to half of the population of this affected region. For Bostonians' team, the Justinianic plague seemed like a highly likely reason for the sudden demographic collapse in Central Africa. It's the most speculative part of our study, says Bostonian. So we don't know for sure that is true. But it is a plausible explanation, although further genetic analysis is needed to confirm our hypothesis. Whether or not the plague is the culprit behind the population collapse, the entire history of the settlement of the southern half of the African continent must be rewritten, Chris. The expansion of Bantu-speaking communities did not happen in one fell swoop since prehistoric times, but at two different points in history. Certain ethnic groups speaking related languages and living in neighboring regions probably do not share, and it was once thought a common ancestor. As it was once thought a common ancestor, they don't share it. So there is no such thing as a Bantu people. And some communities which believe that their roots could be traced back thousands of years are in fact much younger than they ever imagined. Chris Harris. Not 10,000 or 47,000 years, Chris Harris. What does that change? A great deal in Bostonians' opinion. It has turned our view of pre-colonial history completely on its head. For so long, scholars didn't think Africa had a history. Eventually, it was thought that African history was a sort of long, continuous timeline that was only interrupted by the arrival of Europeans, slavery, and then colonialism. The latest, like Chris Harris is always projecting, the latest findings poke holes in the idea of the continuous timeline, amongst other things. Our research also shows that the great Central African kingdoms did not follow a linear path of progressions, Chris Harris. Some are more recent than previously thought, and so. What's remarkable is that they managed to expand after a severe crisis and a population collapse, Bostonian says. Slavery and colonialism were not the first series of crises Central Africa faced. It had an action-packed and rich history. The region was able to get back on its feet without outside help. Bostonian readily admits that At a time when the world is still crippling with the COVID-19 outbreak, it is no coincidence that he wanted to highlight the ideas that a major pandemic could have caused a significant loss of population in the region. Our research demonstrates that Central Africa managed to recover from the pandemic and a sudden episode of climate change, which we of course see as cause for hope. That the big message we want to get across. Did the plague reach the Congo? It is undisputed that the world experienced a cold spell starting in 536 CE and continuing until 575 CE, according to a research carried out by a climate scientist off Buntgen. It is equally undeniable that the bacterium Y pestis, a global killer with fatality rates approaching 100%, as Harper explained in his book, caused worldwide devastation and helped bring down the fall of the Roman Empire beginning in 541 CE. Wow. The question is whether an illness that mainly struck the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean world was able to make its way to Central Africa and wipe out Bantu-speaking populations during the first millennium CE. There is evidence to suggest that this was the case. It is evidence. We're talking about the same period, and we know that the plague also impacted Africa. Some people even say that it originated in Ethiopia. We know this is true because researchers have found evidence for the introduction of metallurgy and millet cultivation. Plus, there was trade between North and Central Africa. In addition, countries like Congo and Zambia still harbor strains of plague that entered the continent in the Middle Ages, Bastian says. In the collective work, Afrique subsaharienne, un continent de histories, Sub-Saharan Africa, a continent full of history, the historian Iwan Gaja, which is an African black man, notes that the powerful kingdom of Aksum, covering an area that is now Ethiopia, traded with southern Arabia and the Roman Empire, while ships sailed the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Aksum, much like Egypt, paid a steep price when the Justinian plague hit. A few centuries later, trade routes starting in Ethiopia, Eritrea extended all the way to Mogadishu, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and the Kingdom of Zimbabwe in the south, and Lake Chad and Kano in the west. Francois Xavier Fauvel and Bertrand Hirsch write in the same book, did the plague follow the same route? We still do not know for certain, but as Professor Bostion put it, it is a plausible explanation. There are some key points that I want to focus on here. All right. The facts is all here. Go back and read it. There's no such thing as a Bantu people. There's no Bantu people that go back that are E1B1A that are Bantu people that go back 47,000 years. 100,000 years as he done upped it up. These are all fraudulent lies, and they can't be proven by anything. Like, share, subscribe to my channel, and if you like my research, you can go ahead and donate to me so I can up this research capability and buy some more equipment. That's $ capital Y lowercase ASHA, capital B, lowercase EN, capital YISHRAEL on Cash App. I thank you. I love you all, and continue to support the program. Like, share, and please subscribe and help get this information out. There's no such thing as a Bantu people.